to use a projector and a screen, but I'll do my best. So as Beth mentioned, I'm with the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, which is a public agency. The Regional Planning Council covers 4 counties: Palm Beach, Martin, St. Lucie, and Indian River County. We have a 28-member board, 18 elected officials, City of Sebastian sits on the board, as well as Indian River County elected officials, City of Vero as well, and 10 gubernatorial appointees. The Regional Planning Council and all the regional planning councils, there are 11 in Florida, were created by the legislature to help local governments with multi-jurisdictional issues and projects. So large-scale development, like developments of regional impact that were that the state really saw a lot of in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. The Regional Planning Council assisted with those types of projects. Certainly projects like All Aboard Florida are multi-jurisdictional. The Regional Planning Council has actually a review responsibility as a public agency to review the project and provide recommendations back to the federal government on behalf of the region, as well as the local governments will carry out that same role as well. So that's kind of the agency that I'm with. It's a public agency. We have been asked by lots of groups like Beth's and others to just provide some background about the project. And so I'll share with you what we know. I think everyone wishes they knew more than they did at this stage of the game, because this is a large project. We don't have a precedent for it in the region. There's actually no precedent for a project this size being introduced by a private company in the state or in the nation at this stage. So we're charting some new ground, I think, both as agency staff members, as local governments, and as members of the public, in trying to understand how to review a project like this and provide some guidance back to the federal government to help encourage maybe a different balance of impacts. So with that, I'll kind of share with you what I know, and I'll be happy to answer questions as we go forward. So this map just illustrates, if you will, the regional rail network in southeast Florida. So that purple line is the CSX rail corridor, which is privately owned. The state actually controls a portion of it from Miami to West Palm, and that's where Tri-Rail runs, which is the commuter rail system that we have to the south. That's also the rail corridor where Amtrak runs today, and then the CSX operates freight out on that corridor through the state of Florida. The blue line, of course, is the FEC rail corridor, so that's Henry Flagler's rail line that came down in the 1900s, and that line is exclusively freight today. There's been different proposals for passenger rail service over time. I had the good fortune of getting to know Beth better when we worked on the Amtrak FEC corridor project a couple of years ago. That's actually a project that's funded in the state's work program, and that would introduce Amtrak service from Jacksonville down to Miami with 8 new stations through the region. One of them would be in downtown Vero, 2 to the south in Fort Pierce and Stewart, and 5 to the north. 5 to the north in Cocoa, Melbourne, Titusville, Daytona, and St. Augustine. So that's one of the projects that's proposed on the corridor. Still, negotiations have to be resolved between Amtrak, the state, and FEC for that to happen. But it is a funded project that the council has advocated for in the past. Another project that's proposed on that corridor is additional Tri-Rail service. So if you're familiar with Tri-Rail, Tri-Rail's commuter service that runs from West Palm to Miami out on the CSX tracks. It has 18 stations and 72 miles. Tri-Rail for many years, and all the local governments that are along the FEC corridor from Jupiter, which is the northern point in Palm Beach County where that service would run, down to Miami, have been working with the state and FEC trying to enable Tri-Rail service to get onto the FEC tracks as well. Actually putting commuter rail where most of the people are seems to make some sense. So that's a project that's in motion as well. It's in levels of discussion, if you will. But otherwise, of course, the condition today is that the FEC corridor runs freight only throughout the state with connections to the main ports. And they're the closest point of contact to Port Miami, which is down in the south, which is one of the major freight ports in the United States. And then Port Everglades, which is kind of a number 2 contender in the state with respect to the amount of freight coming into the state. Oops, let's go forward. So the project that's getting the most attention at this stage of the game is the All Aboard Florida proposal, which is a private proposal that's been proposed by FEC Industries. A little background on the structure as we understand it. FEC for years, of course, ran exclusively freight service through the state of Florida, and back in about 2007, the company was acquired by Fortress Investment Group, which is a kind of an international conglomerate of various investment arms, if you will, within a large corporate structure. Fortress Investment Group bought FEC, the rail line, and all the holdings that FEC had, including the real estate along the corridor, and they restructured the company into 4 divisions. So one of those divisions is called FECI, Florida East Coast Industries, and they're charged with, as the company explains it, passenger rail service and real estate development. So that's one division within this new corporate structure. The other corporation that certainly the city and others are familiar with is the portion that runs railroad today. So that's now called FECR, Florida East Coast Railroad, and they operate the freight on the corridor and actually have some control over the track configuration and access to it. There is a third division within the company, which is called Parallel Infrastructure. They are responsible for telecommunications, and I'll touch on that in a moment, because FECI includes in its proposal the idea of extending high-speed fiber optic service along the FEC corridor, which is an improvement that the Regional Planning Council has suggested is something that could provide some benefit to our local communities in getting access to that high-speed fiber optic that would make us more competitive as a region. So that's kind of an overview of how the project lays on the ground. There are 4 stations FECI is proposing in this phase of service, and they're in downtown West Palm Beach, downtown Fort Lauderdale, downtown Miami, and then the 4th station would be constructed at Orlando International Airport. In terms of geography of their project, they propose to double track the corridor from Miami to Cocoa, which is about 195 miles. FEC controls exclusively its right-of-way, so the proposal is to replace the track that used to be there. So if those of you that know Florida history, it used to be double-tracked until about 1968, and that's when passenger service came off the corridor. FEC actually went out and took that track up. Hindsight being 2020, of course, now we're in 2014, and the proposal is to replace that track in the corridor all the way up to Cocoa, and then the company proposes to build new track along State Road 528, which is the Beachline Expressway. They've already secured an easement from the state of Florida to construct that track. As we understand the terms of that agreement, it would be for passenger service only. It wouldn't be track actually constructed to accommodate freight. This is our understanding, that it would be passenger service from Cocoa into Orlando International Airport. So that's kind of the geography of the project. With respect to the details, and I think many are frustrated that we don't have more information. I know the Regional Planning Council wishes it had more, because we get questions all the time, and we just only have so much information, but here's some of what we have, right? There's a project concept that is for the operation of high-speed intercity express service. We don't have a service like this in the state, so this would be a new type of service. Being express and intercity means it would have a limited number of stations, and those trains would run fairly quickly. That's how express service is defined. And so in 235 miles, the company has 4 stations proposed. That's pretty consistent with the way express service is run in other parts of the world, and the limited express that we have in the Northeast. With respect to speeds, the company is proposing service up to 79 miles an hour from Miami to West Palm Beach, and then changing the class of service to a high-speed service from West Palm to Cocoa, where the company proposes of speeds of up to 110 miles an hour. Certainly in locations where there are grade crossings and development, they physically can't operate that fast. But as we understand it in discussions with the agency, they have to clear the entire segment from kind of where that slower speed service would end and the faster speed service would transition to something else, to give themselves the permission to run up to 110 miles an hour in areas where that's appropriate. We haven't seen the speed forecasts to see what the speeds would be, for example, through Sebastian, but we all hope we'll have that information in the next couple of weeks. The company then proposes to run up to 125 miles an hour from Cocoa to Orlando. That's on new track the company would construct, a new double track. There are 2 grade crossings, but they'd be grade separated, so there'd be no at-grade intersection grade crossings like we have, for example, in the city of Sebastian. And so the grades would actually be separated, train running and road running in 2 separate levels, if you will. So they'd run 125 miles an hour into Orlando. The frequency of service, also new for us to consider. The company is proposing 16 trains per hour, so that's 32 trains per day. Hourly service running from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Many have asked for the market studies that support a service schedule like this, and the company simply hasn't released those yet. They've explained to us there's proprietary data. We as a planning agency continue to ask, and I think many have asked as well, but that data just hasn't been introduced yet. With respect to project time frame, the company is proposing to begin construction later this year. It's already received some environmental clearances to double track the corridor from West Palm to Miami. Again, that section where I indicated on the map earlier, there's a desire for commuter rail service, tri-rail service to run, and double tracking in that corridor has long been identified as a priority. So not a surprise, a much narrower set of improvements for which the company's gotten approvals over the last year or so. So construction again suggested to begin in 2014 and possibly service beginning in 2016, although many question that time frame because to run service you have to have train equipment, and it's our understanding in speaking to industry reps it takes at least 2 years once the trains are ordered to get them constructed and tested and then certified for safe operations. But again, this is the company's data. With respect to permit activity, I mentioned there's an environmental assessment that was already approved, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But more relevant to Indian River County and the northern part of the Treasure Coast is the pending Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, that is in some stage of development now, and it's our understanding it should be released in the next couple of weeks for us to all review. So with respect to project history, what we know is the company announced the project back in 2012, and sometime in 2012 it requested what's called a RIF loan, which is a Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Loan. That type of loan is available, it's a federally backed loan, but as we understand it, it works more like a commercial loan. It's a loan program that's designed for rail infrastructure. We have links to the RIF loan page on our website if you wanted to do some more reading about it. There have been 32 RIF loans that have been approved over the past, I guess, about 8 years. Some are for freight projects, some are for passenger projects, and some are for blended. And so there seems to be some variety in the type of project that can be funded through the RIF loan process. Again, it's a program that is administered by the FRA for the purpose of private investment in rail infrastructure. At least that's how the program is described. So because the company applied for a RIF loan, that triggered the need for the advisory or the regulatory federal agency. In this case, it's the Federal Railroad Administration because it's a passenger and freight corridor that's the subject of discussion. So because that RIF loan was requested, the federal agency is then responsible for producing different environmental documents. So the company split the project into two pieces, if you will. Those simpler improvements, which is the double tracking from West Palm to Miami, was submitted through the federal process in what's called an environmental assessment. Again, a simpler set of improvements, a smaller amount of impact, and that is an easier process, frankly, to navigate. And so that environmental assessment was submitted in October of 2012, and clearance was granted in 2013. In that document, the company indicated all the other improvements were going to be the subject of an environmental impact statement, which is a much bulkier and much more complex environmental document. It's kind of the Cadillac of environmental permits, if you will, with respect to environmental permitting. And so that EIS, which is the acronym I'll use, Environmental Impact Statement, there are a series of what are called scoping meetings that took place back in May of last year. I think the closest one might have been up in Brevard County, and there's one to the south in Fort Pierce. I think they held 5 along the corridor. The purpose of those meetings was for the federal agency to go out and say, public, here's a proposal that we have. Are we addressing all the right issues? Is the scope sufficiently broad for this type of analysis? So many local governments and members of the public and other groups put comments on record to ask for the scope to be broadened. The Regional Planning Council put about 24 items on record with the FRA, asking the scope to include things like passenger rail service for all of the Treasure Coast communities, not just for a station in West Palm, to consider the impact on property values, on navigational concerns. There's 2 movable bridges that have raised concerns, particularly in Stewart and Jupiter, which are both in the region. Impact on property values, impact on grade crossings and the costs that would come to local governments for those types of impacts. And again, it's a laundry list of about 24 things. That was submitted to the FRA along with all the comments from all of the other sources that were secured during that process. To give you an idea of what needs to be covered in an environmental impact statement, and I apologize for the font being so small. So this probably looks like little specks on the screen in the back. But there are 22 different issues that are required to be addressed in an EIS. So we went onto the Federal Register and pulled exactly those issues for this the EIS that's in process now, so folks could understand what's the EIS going to have in it. So and the company is required to address everything from air quality, water quality, impact on listed species, noise and vibration, impact on property values, impact on neighborhoods, environmental justice issues, impact on historic structures, and archaeological sites, a review of the entire transportation network, and that's every form of movement on the transportation network. So impact on rail, roadway and vehicles, boats, pedestrians, bicyclists, airplanes, everything must be addressed in the transportation part of that analysis. Recreational issues and construction impacts and pretty much everything you can imagine is required to be addressed in the EIS. So I just wanted to provide that for your knowledge, and we have links to this information on the Council's website as well. So with that, we're all eagerly awaiting, or maybe cautiously awaiting, the publication of what's called the draft EIS. That's the next stage in the process. That document will be published according to our discussions with the FRA staff. It'll be published in the May-June timeframe. So I'm sensing that's probably end of the month, maybe, beginning of next. It will be a bulky document, so for members of the public who are interested in kind of wading through, it is very technical. It is certainly a public process, though, and it's intended to document and evaluate various conditions, set forth means by which project improvements are mitigated, and then if there's a need for any conditions to be imposed upon those construction activities, they're imposed through that document. I will suggest to you that it is fortunate for the region that a RIF loan was requested, because of the RIF loan triggered this environmental impact statement. In the absence of that, there would be no holistic environmental analysis of the improvements that are proposed by the company, because they just don't have the same permit requirements on the railroad that we're all used to as members of the public. I mean, when someone wants to build a building, there's a normal permit process, or when FDOT needs to build a road, there's a normal kind of public outreach and review process that we're all very used to. We might not like it, but it's the process that we have and we know. With this one, it's a little different. We don't have a path to follow as a regional planning council because we've never had a project of this scale that's been introduced by something other than a public agency. Usually it would be an FDOT producing the project, and there would be meetings about the concepts, and there would be a vetting by the public about where the rail would be improved and where would the stations go and what's the schedule, and there's this iterative dialogue with the public and local governments and business owners about how that project happens. This one is not that type of project. So again, it's got a lot of frustration associated with it for agencies like mine, for the local government, and for others. So that said, here's the process we have. And again, in the absence of the RIF loan, I think one thing that's important to point out is that there isn't a set of normal permit requirements for railroads to construct rail improvements in corridors they own. They're just treated a little differently. And so there isn't a permit necessary, for example, for the FEC to replace a track that used to be there. They have to document compliance with environmental regulations, but you all know the corridor like I do. There's not a lot of habitat left in the 100 feet of land that's owned by FEC. That's not by accident. So the permit threshold is a bit low with respect to those types of things. With respect to grade crossings, FEC has complete control over the grade crossings. And in fact, there's 352 grade crossings on the corridor. Each one has a grade crossing agreement that's written by FEC in favor of FEC with whoever the local government is that has the grade crossing or the state of Florida. So again, there are a lot of pieces to this that it would be very hard for us as an agency or for the public to follow if we didn't have this environmental impact statement. I'll just speak to that as a benefit, I think, at least in terms of the process. That said, pardon me, the draft EIS is supposed to be published in the May-June timeframe, so maybe end of this month, beginning of next. It'll be, I don't know, 1,000, 1,500 pages and a bunch of attachments. We will post it on the council's website. It will be distributed to all the local governments. It is available to any person, any entity who wants to review it. It is a public document when it is released. Accompanying the publication of what's called the draft EIS will be a series of public workshops or public meetings. Those are required in the federal process. As recently as last week, FECI has said they'll hold one in each county, which certainly makes it easier for the public to be able to access those workshops. Look at the plans that are out there, have conversations with the public agency representatives as well as the company to better understand the process. And then with respect to submitting public comments, comments can be submitted in those workshops. They can be submitted in writing, by mail, or by email, or by phone to the federal agency, again, the FRA, that's coordinating this process. The statutory requirement is a 45-day review time. The Regional Planning Council and others have asked for that time frame to be extended to 90 days. Again, we don't have a model to follow. This is a big project, and we don't have a local agency that's assisting in the kind of the review of all these pieces. FECI last week indicated it was willing to extend the time frame to 75 days. That's very considerate. I think the Regional Planning Council will continue to ask for it to be extended to 90. In fact, on the Council's agenda this Friday is a recommendation that the Council send that request to all the local governments, so every local government can make that same request. And this is a pretty big deal for the region, so we think we need a little more time to be able to do a thorough review on behalf of the communities that we represent. Pardon me. Once the public comment period concludes, whatever that time frame is, the FRA will take all that information back, evaluate all the comments that are received. The company will submit more information and evaluations to figure out how to address those comments. And then at some point, and that time frame is not specified, it could be a few months, it could take a year, we don't know how long it will take to address the public comments. The next step is the agency issues what's called a final EIS. That triggers another public comment period, and then after that, the agency would issue what's called a record of decision. The process requires the proposed improvements, which are double tracking the corridor from now West Palm to Cocoa, constructing new double track from Cocoa to Orlando, constructing the 4 new stations, the 3 in the southeast Florida region and 1 in Orlando, all the grade crossing improvements from West Palm to Cocoa, and impacts on all of the bridges. There are 3 movable bridges in the corridor. They're at the New River in Fort Lauderdale, the Loxahatchee River in Jupiter Tequesta, and the St. Lucie River in Stewart, as well as impacts on the fixed bridges. There are 6 fixed bridges, and those exist from Indian River County to the North San Sebastian River, for example. The fixed bridges are also proposed to be replaced and improved, I guess, as part of the improvements. So, all of that stuff is compared to, theoretically, a no-build, because that's the requirement in the process. So that's how the record of decision will be issued. There is the opportunity for the FRA to impose additional conditions as part of the approval of the project, if the project gets approved. So that's really the opportunity, if you're gaming it, right? There are folks who, gosh, they just want the project to go away and they want it to be stopped. And so there's an avenue for that. Probably it's more political than administrative, but it's an avenue that exists. And the other avenue is, if the project gets approved, and it seems as though there's at least a fairly good likelihood that something will get approved, that conditions that better balance impacts in our communities can be imposed through the EIS process. Like, for example, adding additional stations in the northern part of the Treasure Coast, so there's a balance of economic benefit that offsets some of the costs that would otherwise be carried. All those kinds of things are the subject for discussion in the EIS. With respect to public outreach, again, very frustrating that there's not a local public agency that's responsible for the project. And so the Regional Planning Council has taken on somewhat of a role of public outreach because it's a multi-jurisdictional project and it affects all 4 of the counties in our jurisdiction. And so we've been doing all sorts of presentations with the public as requested. We came up to Sebastian's City Council a couple weeks ago. I'll be at Indian River County's MPO tomorrow. So we've tried to at least provide some information for the public because, again, there's a lot of frustration. That's also allowed us to get a lot of feedback, a lot of issues that have been raised in that dialogue. So we've been able to package up all those concerns and send them to the FRA to ask that they be addressed. And so with that, and I should mention, the Council hasn't taken a position on the project. There's really not something to take a position against or for yet because there's no document except for the EIS. And so the Council is waiting for that document to be released so that it can take some appropriate action as in respect to that. So with that, on May 21st, pardon me, the Council did take formal action with respect to the project. Based on all that outreach, we sent correspondence to the FRA to ask that they consider a laundry list of issues in the completion of that draft EIS document. So there were about 25 or 26 additional issues that were raised, summarized here. Passenger rail stations being located in the northern part of the region for both Amtrak service as well as at least some intermittent all-aboard Florida service, addressing grade crossings and quiet zones, bridge and marine navigational impacts, another concern that we've heard a lot about, access to broadband capacity, and I'll talk about that in a moment as a public benefit, the rationalization of freight, which is better balancing the type of freight movements in the state using both the FEC corridor, which is privately owned and controlled by a for-profit corporation, and the CSX corridor, which is privately owned with respect to freight operations and controlled by a for-profit corporation. But that said, from a regional standpoint, perhaps there's a better balance between the through freight trains, which are the big, long, heavy trains that have 3 engines, that are running, frankly, through the region and through the state and exiting in Jacksonville. Maybe all those don't have to come through the downtowns on the FEC. Maybe some of those can happen over on the CSX. But certainly there's local freight and there's local businesses that operate by having access to that freight. That freight maybe stays over on the FEC corridor as it does. Again, this is a big ask because they're 2 private companies that make money by moving freight. But there's an opportunity perhaps to get some relief for the region through this project. Land use and transportation impacts. I mentioned to you Tri-Rail service runs today on the CSX corridor, which is that corridor out to the west. That was the purple line. Tied into the discussion of passenger rail is the idea of adding Tri-Rail service on the eastern line, which is the FEC. Not as tangential an issue for Sebastian, but I thought I would mention it to you. And then impacts on wildlife. So this was all packaged up in correspondence that went to the FRA. It's all posted on our website. Coincidentally, the agency delayed the issuance of the EIS, so we're hopeful that it meant they were addressing these issues. Certainly other issues were raised at the same time. The issuance of the EIS was delayed from March, April to May, June, so maybe that extra 2 months meant there was a closer look at some of these issues that have been raised, not just by the Regional Planning Council, but by a whole host of folks, elected officials and otherwise. The second thing the Council did was ask for the public comment period to be extended to 90 days, and that is a request that continues forward. And finally, we asked for the FRA to come down and hold some workshops in the region, because again, we don't have a local agency, a local public agency that's responsible for this process. So if our local governments are going to be able to respond appropriately, we want to have their staff come down and help us through that process, because we don't have a model to follow. The types of detail, and I've already touched on some of these things. Amtrak service, of course, proposed several years ago. It's funded in the state budget. It would introduce 3 new stations in the region, Fort Pierce, Vero, and Stewart. A great local benefit, and guess what? Those stations could also accommodate all-aboard Florida stations as well, all-aboard Florida service. They need a different platform, but you'd have a station with parking and you'd have a physical structure. Why wouldn't we want those other trains to stop as well and give us a little local access and local economic benefit? With respect to quiet zones and grade crossings, there are not a lot of folks that are really happy about train horns. That's one thing that I've certainly learned in talking to many different communities. The project provides an opportunity for quiet zones to be established. That means additional safety infrastructure such that local communities, local governments like Sebastian can say, hey, federal government, this grade crossing is safe enough so that we declare it's going to be a quiet zone. And we certify that we meet these safety standards. Train operator, you don't have to blow your horn. That's an opportunity that gets created with this additional safety infrastructure. It's been a very high priority through the region, and also getting pedestrian grade crossings. We've got plenty of locations in the region where you've got sidewalks that come all the way up to the grade crossing, and then they don't go across. And so we've asked, as a council, for those pedestrian improvements to be added into the project and have the project pay for those things so we have safe pedestrian access as well as vehicular. Pardon me. I touched on the bridge and marine navigational impacts. Of course, one of the enormous challenges with the project is that every time a train comes through at the movable bridges, and you don't have movable bridges up here, but the furthest northern movable bridge is at the St. Lucie River, the bridge has to close and lock, the train goes across, no boats can pass while that's taking place. There's only about 6 feet of clearance, and then the bridge opens afterwards. So that's clearly a very significant impact on marine navigation. We've asked, as a council, the FRA take a much closer look, and we've been directly engaged with the Coast Guard in that dialogue as well. There are some safety issues and modernization needs as well. Broadband capacity, one of FEC's corporate divisions, if you will, parallel infrastructure, has indicated it's going to install high-speed fiber optic on the whole corridor, like 360 strands of fiber. That's like Google speed fiber. So if you're familiar with fiber optic service, it's a tremendous economic enhancement. It's a for-profit service. What the council has said is, gosh, it's great that you're installing that. We'd like to get access for local governments. for all of the educational users, for the hospitals, for the nonprofit biotech and biomed, for the identified economic clusters, and we'd like to get that either free or at a discounted rate as part of this project being installed. That's a request that's been carried forward. It has not been responded to yet, but the council is hopeful. Freight rationalization, I already touched on the idea of balancing the freight, where the freight goes on the two networks. One of the things that's taking place at the same time this project is being evaluated is the construction of two rail connections. At the southern end of the corridor in Miami, there's one called the Iris connection, which is right at the Port of Miami, connecting the FEC and the CSX. And then further to the north in West Palm Beach is a connection along 25th Street called the Northwood connection. Connecting those two corridors means trains can run back and forth. We actually have congressional attention and legislative attention on this issue, so the council would suggest now is the time to press the issue of freight rationalization and figure out if we can get some help from other voices, for example, Tallahassee and Washington, to help find a way to get some of that bigger freight moved out west so it doesn't run through all the downtowns. Because if you're going to have any kind of train, the freight trains are big, heavy, and slow, and the passenger trains tend to be light, faster, and quieter. And so many would suggest those are better trains to have, let's say, in the downtowns. Pardon me. Nearing the end of this section. Impacts on in downtown. Certainly there are a number of historic downtowns and the train runs right through. There are parking improvements right in the right-of-way on leased land, but they're critical to the economic vitality of those communities. There's concerns that have been raised about emergency response and impacts on listed species as well. So all that stuff is in the hands of the FRA, along with all the other comments that have come from others, and we're all waiting for that draft EIS to be issued. Three other quick points. The second is the FRA participated with local governments from Miami up to St. Lucie County. They haven't done Indian River County yet. But from Miami to St. Lucie, they went in the field and did what are called diagnostic field reviews. And as part of those reviews, the FEC explained, here's the kind of service we intend to run. These are the improvements we think we need. FDOT participated and said, okay, we think these things are fine, or maybe you need to do these additional things. And the FRA kind of listened to that discussion, took those notes, and came away with a set of recommendations about what actually needs to be installed. And so those recommendations were packaged up in a safety report that was published in the beginning of last month. It is also posted on the council's website. And what it does is it looks at the high-speed rail portion of the corridor and says, in this section from West Palm to St. Lucie, that's all that's been evaluated so far, you must install the highest level of safety standards, which tends towards 4-quadrant gates and more expensive safety infrastructure, as well as pedestrian crossings wherever there's a sidewalk nearby. Why that's important is that if you're a community that wants to get a quiet zone established, there's only so much safety infrastructure that can be installed. And so if the company carries the cost of the more expensive stuff, quite frankly, it's easier for the local governments and much less expensive to install quiet zones. So that's the recommendation that stands right now up to St. Lucie County. The company and FRA have indicated they'll do the evaluations from Indian River north to Cocoa in July. We would expect the same type of recommendation. Again, it's an improvement people seem to want and a cost that can be carried by the project. Third point, we've established an enormous amount of information on the council's website. So if you want to do some background reading, there's summaries, there's timelines, there's links to all the federal agencies. Every document we've received from a public agency is posted. All of the public comments are posted as well. So at least there's a place kind of locally, if you will, where you can go get information. You don't have to go from agency to agency to track down all these different documents. So that's available just as a kind of a public service, if you will, and that's at tcrpc.org, which is TomCharlieRogerPaulCharlie.org. Okay? We've gotten all sorts of recent public comments as an agency. Every council meeting agenda, we include those in the package. Now they're all being posted on the website as well, just for ease of access. And finally, the council meets about 8 times a year. Our next meeting is on Friday. There's a series of recommended actions on the agenda for this Friday. Asking FECI to disclose information about corporate structure and its financial background, although perhaps that's an unlikely request to be responded to. That's a lot of the conversation, which is, who is this company and what are they made of? So that request is on the council's agenda for consideration. Making an appeal to all the local governments to ask everybody to send in a request to get the public comment period to 90 days. Seems like a reasonable request, and there's strength in numbers. A request to FDOT asking the department to follow those sealed corridor guidelines, those safety recommendations that came down from the FRA. We've already been in dialogue with the DOT staff, and that seems to be the direction the agency is heading in. Certainly doesn't help to make a formal request. The fourth thing is, again, to ask the FRA and the federal agencies to come down here and work in the region, but not expect us to have dialogue with Atlanta for one office and Washington for the next and New Orleans for a third, but instead to ask those agencies to come down and help the local governments get prepared with respect to developing public comments, and then once those comments are developed, the end of that public comment period, to ask them to come down again so we can present that to the agencies and make sure we're hitting all these points in the right way. If there's additional information we need, we'd like them to help us understand what else do we need to make our case in these matters so we can make the most solid case as a region. And then finally, one minor point, but we became aware later in the discussion about double tracking that's proposed through St. Lucie Village, where trains would be stored. Essentially, you would cut off access to the entire community if a train is waiting there to get clearance to cross the bridge in St. Lucie, at the St. Lucie River. So we've added that as an amended request to the agency to ask them to focus on that. So with that, I apologize for moving kind of quickly. It's a lot of information. I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. But also, and I'll hang around afterwards because I know we're running late. My contact information is here. I'm the point staff member for the Regional Planning Council. So if you have questions that I can follow up on for you, I'll certainly do that. Okay? Thanks.